Crisis in the Gulf. In this upfront special, we'll debate the feud between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and ask whether the Trump administration is making the situation much worse. As the standoff between Qatar and the Saudi-led coalition shows no signs of reaching a resolution, is the biggest Gulf crisis for decades set to escalate even further? And are the accusations against Qatar of regional meddling and support for quote-unquote extremism justified? I'm joined by Fahad Attiyah, the Qatari ambassador to Russia, and Ali Al-Shahabi, a Saudi analyst and the executive director of the Arabia Foundation. Thank you both for joining me on Upfront. Fahad Attiyah, is Qatar in a state of war now with its neighbours? Because the Qatari defence minister, who also happens to be your brother, described the blockade imposed by Saudi, the UAE, Egypt and the rest as a declaration of war without blood. Is rhetoric like that helpful at a time like this? Doesn't that just lead to further escalation?
Well, let me first say that it's not a rhetorical statement. It is a fact. Under international law, what the four countries have done is violated the very principles of the UN Charter, which governs the relationships between states. They violated the Arab League Charter. They violated the GCC, the various agreements and treaties that have been signed between them by taking unilateral coercive measures without going through the due process, without submitting any grievances, without making any complaints to any of the international organizations. So I'd like to describe it that it is first an aggression, an illegal aggression under international law.
Ali Al-Shahabi, illegal aggression under international law. These are not just a list of friendly demands. Aggression is what Fahad Attiyah is calling.
Well, it's certainly serious action taken after over 10 years of mediation and diplomatic efforts to stop what Saudi Arabia and its partners see as direct and indirect subversion of their security. Direct, working directly to subvert the security of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as we saw in the tapes that came out after Gaddafi was overthrown, between the Emir of Qatar and Gaddafi, and indirect by financing terrorist organizations, as we saw with the ransom amount paid a month ago, which the Financial Times and the Independent and many media confirmed to terrorist organizations in Iraq and Lebanon. So those two things, direct and indirect subversion, would have been a cause for war a long time ago had a country like Saudi Arabia and its allies not agreed to be patient and to accept mediation and to accept diplomacy.
So before I let Fahad respond to the strong allegations, just let me ask you this. Why now?
Well, I think there was an opportunity as President Trump came into the White House and wanted, and there was a seriousness to build a coalition to fight terrorism in the region and to stand up against Iranian expansionism. The GCC could not do that by having one of its brothers undermining it from within.
Fahad Attiyah, subversion, direct and indirect, undermining the GCC from within.
Well, it's very interesting that it comes from someone that is who's backed by Saudi Arabia, that have for many years and decades have subverted almost every political system that exists within the Islamic world, starting from Qatar. I mean, let's go back to 1996. What has the Saudi regime and the UAE regime have done, including Bahrain, and let me say Egypt was also part of it, was to try and attempt in regime change in 1996, unprovoked completely by Qatar. They have been relentless in trying to show us that we are somehow a province of Saudi Arabia, not an independent nation, with our ability to forge our foreign policy. So subversion, I think, is nothing but a pretext to Saudi trying to accuse us of terrorism, of funding terrorism. These are all pretextual issues. The real issue is where Saudi stands and UAE stand to the aspirations of the Arab world. And this is the elephant in the room that nobody wants to discuss. And I think Qatar comes to champion that progressive view of the future of the Arab world that has been grappled by dictatorship and tyrannical systems over 50 years.
Well, let me put this point to Ali Shahabi. Let me be clear for our viewers. Neither Qatar nor Saudi Arabia are democracies. But what Fahad Attiyah is saying is that Qatar is a country which has backed quote-unquote democratic revolutions in places like Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab Spring. He's saying, I think this is a quite widely shared view, that Saudi Arabia, UAE are, quote, counter-revolution. They didn't like the Arab Spring. They didn't like democracy in Tunisia or Egypt.
You can certainly give Qatar credit for backing revolution everywhere but Qatar. For example, a famous poet in Qatar wrote a poem a few years ago where he called for the Arab Spring to come to Qatar, something to that effect. He was arrested, thrown in jail, sentenced to life imprisonment. Ibn Adib, the ambassador will certainly know him, sentenced to life imprisonment, and just let out now after 5 years in jail. So it's blatant hypocrisy.
I will let Fahad respond to that.
It's blatant hypocrisy. Now let me just add one other point. Saudi Arabia, the history goes back to the fact that the emir's current father, the father emir, overthrew his father when his father was abroad in the early 1990s. The Gulf countries were very uncomfortable with that. They did not want the cycle of cousin overthrowing cousin, father, son overthrowing father to start in the GCC. Yeah. So yes, they were very hostile to that act. Yeah. So when the father emir tried to get back to power with the help of people inside, the neighbors were not against that. That's a different story from the Emir of Qatar sitting with Gaddafi and telling him, one, I want to break up Saudi Arabia into 3 countries. And number 2, I promise you that 12 years from now, Al Saud will not exist. That is open, hostile action by a neighbor that would have caused war under any circumstance.
Fahad al-Attiyah.
I mean, what started with a lie will almost end up with a lie. I mean, this is just a continued culture of Saudi representatives like Ali al-Shahabi and others coming on TV outlets, lying blatantly and spreading these conspiracies about Qatar and about our standing and our position.
What are the lies, exactly? Let's go point by point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you come and point that Qatar, that you were just trying to help the Qatari people remove their leader in 1996, this is absolutely false. You were there with your armies ready to come and do a violent move in Qatar in 1996. And numerously in Bahrain and in other places in the region. I mean, in Tunisia only, the UAE has been funding the counter-revolution. All I'm trying to say is Saudi Arabia and the UAE are simply paranoid about the changes that are happening in the Middle East that is outside of their control.
Well, let me put this point to Ali Shabi. A lot of people watching will say, yes, Qatar has issues with supporting groups that they shouldn't have supported in Syria and other places. But Hillary Clinton said this in 2009. Donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. Isn't this the pot calling the kettle black?
No, first of all, you use the Hillary Clinton quote, and everybody's been using that because it serves their purpose. What you should use is a more recent quote last summer by the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorism Finance, the expert in America, testifying in front of Congress under oath. And he said Saudi Arabia is the regional leader in fighting terrorist finance.
But if you're going to quote the State Department, they've also praised Qatar. But they've also praised Qatar in that same report, as you know.
No.
So why are you picking a fight? The outgoing US ambassador to Qatar said the same thing.
The person responsible for terrorism financing, in his testimony under oath to Congress, called Saudi Arabia the regional leader in fighting terrorist finance. That means that the issue of terrorism financing in Saudi Arabia has been eliminated for over a decade.
Eliminated?
Yes, for over a decade. Now, there's a fundamental issue here. The fundamental issue is not, are we for freedom or are we not for freedom? The fundamental issue is the hypocrisy of Qatar. In other words, you are all for freedom everywhere else, but when a poet criticizes the emir, he's sentenced to life in prison.
Fahad al-Attiyah, let's deal with the point about you promote democracy everywhere, but not at home, is the argument. The Saudis are saying, we'd prefer not to promote democracy anywhere. You're promoting it abroad, but not at home.
Mehdi, I mean, it all came clear, and when the list of demands, so-called list of demands, came to bear for the world to see. What did it include? It included a limitation on our sovereignty. It included the limitation on freedom of speech. If you want to restrict freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia and UAE, that's your prerogative. But don't come and try and impose it on everyone else in your neighborhood, in the region, in Egypt, in Yemen,
what about the poet that Ali
Morocco, in Algeria.
What about the poet who was locked up?
Ibn Adib.
No, again, Ali al-Shahabi has and once was part of the MBC group Al-Arabiya was a sister of that, which fabricated all the stories about Qatar. The poet was indeed imprisoned, but for complete different reasons, and he is now released. He was imprisoned for purposes of defamation. He was not imprisoned because of what Ali have referenced. Going back to the demands, going back to what the Emiratis and the Saudis, closing of Al Jazeera, what has this to do with the accusations that Ali has said? Ali Shahabi managed to point to one person in our jails. Can he please tell us how many political prisoners are there in Saudi, or there in Abu Dhabi, or there in Egypt?
How many prisoners are there in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi?
There are political prisoners in Saudi Arabia, but I will mention also 6,000 members of the Murrah tribe who were kicked out of Qatar and had their nationality taken away.
But the question then is, everyone has a right to say, if Saudi Arabia wants to go around talking about extremism, terrorism, freedom, etc., shouldn't you sort out your own place first? Why lecture the rest of the region?
Saudi Arabia and its allies...
You're admitting you're political prisoners.
Saudi Arabia is saying, do not undermine my security. When he talks about sovereignty, by the way, sovereignty is not absolute. Sovereignty is not absolute. It's like human freedom. It's not absolute. You cannot have human freedom to hurt your fellow man. Sovereignty, you cannot have sovereignty if you are going to undermine the security of your neighbors. When your three neighbors, your only three physical neighbors turn against you, in addition to Egypt, something's wrong. Little Qatar with 250,000 citizens against 30 million people around it.
Fahad, are you isolated?
I mean, it's funny that Ali speaks on behalf of those millions of people, as if those millions of people he referenced to have any say in what the regimes have actually conducted.
Well, they don't have any say in Qatar either.
In the Emirates and in Saudi, they have told their citizens that they will face a prison sentence of up to 15 years for sympathizing with Qatar. I mean, what has this to do with the political actions, the so-called political actions
in what is happening in Qatar?
Mr. Shahabi is accusing us?
Look. I mean, at the end of the day, the point is subverting the security of your neighborhood.
And that subverting the security requires shutting down Al Jazeera. Do you support shutting down Al Jazeera?
No,
because you're sitting on Al Jazeera right now.
Well, remember, there are two differences. There's Al Jazeera English, which behaves rather professionally. There's Al Jazeera Arabic, which is a political arm of the Qatari government.
The demands didn't isolate. The demands said shut down Al Jazeera, which has been condemned by the UN, Reporters Without Borders, the New York Times editorial board.
Al Jazeera is a political arm of the Qatari government.
So shut down the whole thing, is your view.
Or put this on a level playing field. Either Al Jazeera applies the same rules to itself, to Qatar, as it applies to its neighbors, or it stops promoting all the opposition figures of every government, giving a platform to Al-Qaeda and Nusra. All the terrorists in the Middle East have gotten a platform on Al Jazeera, subverting the security of everybody. How can Qatar benefit from that? The point is, Qatar is a wooden house in a neighborhood full of wooden houses. If you light a fire with your neighbor, you're going to burn yourself down too. So Qatar will sink or swim with its neighbors. And this is what the Qataris don't seem to understand.
Deal with the point about Al Jazeera Arabic that he's making.
I'm not a spokesman of Al Jazeera, but I think Al Jazeera can answer this for itself. It has conducted itself with international standards of journalism.
Very selective international standards.
All of these awards.
Okay, well,
why don't you talk about the countless hours that of nonsense that you feed the Saudi population about leaders just greeting people or such low-level entertainment in order to
we're running out of time. We have a separate debate about Al Jazeera. Just to be clear,
about the war in Yemen, so they don't ask serious questions about what's going on in Syria.
Ultimately, the issue is the security of the GCC.
Just to be clear, okay, so ultimately,
and Qatar has to bear responsibility for working to undermine the security of the GCC. And it will be held accountable for that.
Just to be clear, you keep talking about the neighbors being against Qatar. What about the idea that Turkey is on Qatar's side? Iran, you say you want to stop Iranian expansions. Your whole plan has backfired. Qatar has now been pushed into Iran's arms.
No, I mean,
the Saudis have miscalculated.
It hasn't backfired. Look, this
really?
issue...
The Turks and the Iranians have come out very fully behind Qatar.
Well, so what? This issue is going to take...
undermines your strategy.
No, it doesn't, because the three direct neighbors... Look, Qatar is part of the GCC. It's part of the GCC family. It's historically, geographically, tribally part of that. You cannot avoid
we're not a province of Saudi Arabia and UAE.
When your family isolates you, you have done something wrong. You see? So the point is now, how do you deal with this with Qatar? It's going to take time. The Qataris are going to resist, but they're going to be isolated. They're going to be cut off from their family.
Fine,
and then the Qatari people in the end, and even within the family and the elite, are going to turn to the leaders and say, is it worth it?
Okay, well,
is it worth it to be cut off from our family?
Well, let's put that last point to Fahad Al-Attiyah. Ambassador, are you going to be isolated indefinitely? Can 300,000 Qataris stand up to their neighbors, their family, what Ali Al-Shahabi calls your family? Or is Iran and Turkey your new alliance?
They will be held accountable, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and Egypt, for all the violations that they have committed against Qatar in breach of all the international conventions, and they will also be held liable by their societies in history for all the violations that they have committed against them over the years.
But is your relationship,
and the opportunities that they have
before we finish,
is
your relationship with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain and others, is that now finished, or is that fixable? Or you've said some pretty strong things about your neighbors.
It is ultimately
fixable.
fixable.
Is it fixable? Ali says it's ultimately fixable.
It's ultimately fixable,
okay,
but they will take a number of years of isolation.
Absolutely. It is absolutely fixable when there are some level-headed people working on the other side, respecting the very fundamentals of a good neighborhood, and treating Qatar with, and not only Qatar, but the rest of the countries in the region with the respect and dignity that we treat them with. We are not a province of Saudi Arabia. We are not a province of the UAE. We're an independent nation with our own foreign policy that does not undermine the security of our neighbors in the region. This is all part of a large pretext to undermine democracies and the movement for emancipation of the Arab world.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront. Caught in the middle of a row between two key allies, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the US is sending mixed messages. So is the Trump administration exacerbating this current Gulf crisis? And who will be the regional winners and losers? To discuss this, I'm joined by Bernard Hakel, Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and Barbara Slavin, Director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront. Bernard Hakel, when it comes to the Qatar-Saudi crisis, President Donald Trump seems to be firmly in the Saudi camp. You never know with Trump where his allegiance is really like. But he seems to be firmly with Saudi Arabia. His Pentagon and his State Department aren't. What's going on?
Two things. One is that, and this is where Trump, I think, didn't realize where his own people stood. One is that Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State of the United States, has a very long-standing relationship with Qatar, dating back to ExxonMobil and its operations in Qatar. And so there's a personal connection there, which I think the Qataris were able to mobilize. The other is that there's a huge base at Al Udeid in Qatar, without which CENTCOM, U.S. military, couldn't really operate in the entire region.
Barbara Slavin, Bernard mentioned Qatar mobilizing its kind of past relationship with Rex Tillerson. We've also seen the Saudis mobilizing their relationship with this new president, with Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and the Crown Prince, the new Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Do you think it's helped Saudi Arabia to have someone with so little knowledge of the region? Has Saudi Arabia played Trump? Have they manipulated him?
I don't know. I mean, I think it certainly is interesting that these moves against Qatar followed the Trump visit to Saudi Arabia. I mean, that in itself was such an extraordinary event that the President of the United States, as his first foreign trip, would go to Saudi Arabia, of all countries. So I think that emboldened the Saudis. That visit had been engineered largely by Mohammed bin Salman and Jared Kushner. It was pronounced a great success. It was probably the most praised thing that Trump had done, at least in terms of the adulation that he felt in the room when he was in Saudi Arabia. So was that playing him? Yes, perhaps, but I think the Saudis miscalculated in the sense that they thought that the approval of the President of the United States would be sufficient for their cause.
But do you think Saudi Arabia could have done this? Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt could have pulled off this blockade, this quite dramatic escalation, without Trump's seal of approval?
I think Barbara is correct that they felt emboldened, true, but I think it's not just a Saudi call. This is also very much a UAE operation, also an Egyptian operation. Each of these countries has actually quite different views on Qatar and are bothered by different issues that Qatar does. And this is, by the way, a long-standing feud. It's not something that just emerged recently.
But why now then?
Saudi Arabia and the UAE want to consolidate and unite all Sunni powers against both Iran and against ISIS, and show Trump that they're united. And Qatar was the one sort of squeaky wheel in that configuration. So,
Barbara, Bernard mentions Iran.
Yes.
You wrote recently that the Saudi pressure on Qatar, the Saudi-led escalation, is an own goal in relation to relations with Iran. How so?
Well, I mean, you know, we don't know how this is all going to end up, but certainly in the short term, Iran has profited enormously. I mean, we had the spectacle of all these Sunni countries uniting supposedly against Iran and against ISIS and against the Muslim Brotherhood. Also, you left them out.
There was going to be an anti-Iran Sunni NATO, we were told at one stage.
Yeah, an Arab NATO and so on. And now you have the GCC completely divided. You have countries against each other. You have Kuwait and Oman very uncomfortable with the Saudi UAE push against Qatar. And the Iranians are providing food and other essentials to Qatar. So it's really helped the Iranians. The Iranians look like they're humanitarians. They're coming to the aid of this little country which is being bullied by its big neighbors. And
if I may interrupt, Qatar has no bread in Iran. I mean, it does not belong in the Iranian camp. They're on opposite sides in the Syrian war, clearly. I mean, Qatar is an Arabian, tribal Wahhabi state. And its heartland is Arabia, and it's not Iran, and it will come back to the fold. Now, how it's going to come back to the fold and unite with the GCC will depend largely on the United States. I mean, if the United States says, enough, we are going to end this now, it'll end.
How?
It will end. I think the Americans.
I mean, we're not going to withdraw our 10,000 troops from
but I think the Americans
airbase.
basically have to become much more proactive. They have to basically tell all sides that concessions have to be made on both sides, and that this has to end, because the larger goal, which is that of fighting ISIS, fighting Iran, or containing Iran, is being sacrificed.
Surely someone like yourself who's been studying this region for many, many years doesn't have any confidence in Donald Trump to do any of the things you just said need to be done.
Now, I think if Donald Trump and Tillerson and Mattis were on the same page, it would have ended much quicker.
But they're not.
They're not.
How do you get them on the same page?
Well, I mean, that's a Washington problem. That's not a Middle Eastern problem.
The State Department is going to undertake, is going to take this portfolio. We don't have an Assistant Secretary of State.
Especially if Jared Kushner is running Middle East policy and he's close to MBS, as we're told. Bernard, you mentioned what's a Washington problem. Let's talk about the Middle East problems. A lot of people would say that Qatar clearly has issues with some of the quote-unquote extremist groups it's backed in places like Syria. But a lot of people would say, fine, Qatar has a lot to answer for, but surely Saudi Arabia is the last country that should be lecturing or sanctioning anyone else over support for extremism. Interestingly, you wrote a New York Times piece recently suggesting that Saudi Arabia isn't to blame for the spread of so-called jihadist ideology, as many in the West and in the region seem to think so. Why?
Okay, so the reason for that is because the question of jihadism and global jihadism, as you well know, is a global phenomenon, and it cannot be reduced to a single country or a single ideology or a single, cause. I think it's a complicated issue, and the Saudis have certainly promoted an intolerant form of the faith, but intolerance doesn't necessarily lead to violence, and I think the correlation between intolerance and violence has not been proven.
Okay, Barbara, shaking her head.
I'm shaking my head because all of these groups, use textbooks that come initially from Saudi Arabia. You see country after country where they had a moderate form of Islam, places like Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, that are now absolutely infected with extreme forms of the faith. And I think there is a connection. I mean, people who do not regard Christians or Jews or Shia as human beings, they're outside the faith, and therefore it doesn't matter if we kill them.
Well, look, this is my bread and butter. This is what I study. The Saudis have been promoting Salafism since 1925. The jihadist issue didn't emerge till the 1990s. What happened in the intervening period? Where were these jihadis between 1925 and 1990?
Okay, so we can argue about the ideological debate, which we probably need more time for. Let's just deal with the money side of things, for example.
Right.
Isn't it fair to say, and we're sitting here on Al Jazeera, which is funded and owned by the Qatari government, let's be clear about that both Qatar and Saudi Arabia have been criticized by the United States Treasury Department, State Departments for funding groups they shouldn't be funding. And therefore, taking a step back from what is the exact relationship between the groups, my wider point still is, How do you look at the region and say that one country gets to lecture the other country on this subject? Don't they all have questions to answer?
Well, the Treasury Department actually has been fairly clear that since 9/11, the Saudis have cleaned up their act and are very careful in how the money is spent. As far as Syria is concerned, though, and this is where I want to...
They said the same about Qatar. But
yes, okay. And the one thing I do want to say, though, about Syria is that in Syria, the Americans, the Saudis, and the Qataris have funded different Syrian factions who ended up becoming jihadists by joining either ISIS or Nusra. But that wasn't sort of deliberately designed. I mean, in other words, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Americans were not funding ISIS or Nusra. It just happens because of the internal dynamics of the Syrian civil war that these factions became much more radical and much more jihadi.
And yet today the Saudi Arabians and the Emiratis are using that partly as a weapon with which to beat Qatar.
It's the pot calling the kettle black. I'm sorry, I don't see much of a distinction between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or any of these other countries when it comes to funding these groups. We left out Turkey also, which has had a big role in supporting groups that have become subsumed
and they're
by...
not Salafi, by the way.
That subsumed by Nusra and so on. So I think everyone, has to bear some measure of guilt for this.
On that note, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you both for joining me on the show. That is our show. Up Front, we'll be back next week.